and from Wenatchee. And I remember seeing him there. He hated me. He was very hostile. And I always wondered what his interest was in me. Probably had something to do with the rape. And basically mafia working with United States government. So, the farmer's woman who screwed me out of my $50,000 included with other people is Donna Ciaramella, Italian-American. Carl and Mary Del Balzo, who I was forced to work for after I was implanted with microchips in 1995, who basically work in secret projects for a microchip company at that time. They were doing that, and also for government, Italian-American. An individual who was gleefully excited and following the police car as I was being taken much later, years later, to a Tennessee mental institution to be tortured and drugged up. I looked at him and I could tell right off the bat by looking at him he's Italian-American. When I was also later, which I will get into, in Washington, D.C., trying to go to CPS and then having to talk to an attorney that worked with CPS and represented them at the time. The person blocking me from getting these services and therefore getting my son back was Italian-American. So not all Italian-Americans are bad, but there's definitely a group that's probably connected to each other, and they're also connected to the United States government. Leon Panetta, CIA, and now Pentagon Department of Defense, Italian-American. So basically, going back to Wenatchee alone, it wasn't just Italian-Americans. There were white people, some people who were Mormons that knew about my even being implanted, and there were some Irish that hated me, they were Catholic Irish, and they were connected to the Bechtolds and to other groups. And there were Hispanics that hated me just because, mainly I think a lot of them became infuriated by this whole, all the lies they were being fed about, what I thought of the Catholic Church. And I think also there was a the Mexicans really have a lot of interfighting as well. And if I wasn't on the right side of the right Mexican group, then they were very passionate about going after you and ruining your life. So if they were doing favors for the Italian Americans that said, hey, do something about this, they'd do that. Same thing, there were some Russians in the area. Basically, anybody who thinks that they're going to get a payoff in some way or benefit. There are a lot of people who are easily corrupted and can be corrupted. So most of the situations where I was quote-unquote banned, however, those situations were coming from Italian Americans, which is really a little bit strange. And that's what was happening in Wenatchee. So so basically, after my son and I were out of, I was required at the time, since I had some state assistance, I was required to meet with a social worker, and the social worker was Julia Thornton. And I was having counseling. I went to counseling voluntarily after my son was born because of PTSD that I had. I had some anxiety. My main problem, I wasn't having hallucinations or delusions or nothing like that. My main problem was anxiety. And it was justified anxiety because of the things that people had done to me. And I also told her that I felt if that sort of treatment stopped, there wouldn't be anything wrong with me, which I still know is true. Aside from being tortured or harassed, I'm very normal, and I've always been normal. I've had my moments of quote-unquote what you call meltdowns, where you just lose it and you get upset and angry or you cry or that kind of thing like anyone does. I've had meltdowns, but I've never had breakdowns. I've never had a breakdown, like a nervous breakdown or anything. I've never lost my mind or forgotten who I am or what I was, or nothing weird. And instead, I've just had a lot of people defaming me. So what happened next was that I was trying to get health care for me and my son. And I did have this counseling with this one woman, but she then said that she couldn't counsel me anymore because she was part of the Columbia Valley. And she told me Dr. Butler suddenly wanted records, and they were trying to make me sound crazy. He started telling her that I was paranoid schizophrenic after he had banned me from the clinic when they knew that I was looking for a lawyer for a law firm for my damages and my son's damages. So she said she wasn't going to give them the records. I don't know what Brett McDonald's relationship was to my social worker. I didn't know at the time, but then I found out she's best friends with her. So there's a very serious conflict of interest. I had Brett McDonald acting as my counselor in a confidential way. And then I had Tina Thornton as my social worker, and those two women were best friends. I didn't know that until later. So all of this information that I was sharing with Brett McDonald, she was able to share with my social worker, who had power to then talk to CPS or cause a problem if she wanted to. And when I wanted to talk to Brett McDonald about the FBI and the things that they'd done, she told me that she wouldn't hear anything to do with the FBI. So the fact that she didn't want me to say anything on the record about the FBI makes me wonder if she's connected to the FBI. Because most people don't shut somebody down in counseling from talking about whatever they want to talk about, whatever the issue may be. So if Brett McDonald, the woman that I supposedly had given my report to initially was Julia Thornton, and I don't know to this day if she's related to Tina Thornton, who was my social worker. I mean, it just could be a coincidence with names. But for whatever reason, I do know and can confirm that that Tina Thornton, this social worker I was required to have, and Brett McDonald were best friends. So, so I stopped having counseling with Brett because basically I think that they said that I couldn't, like the funding, or since I was kicked out from one place, I couldn't have counseling anymore with the other place. And otherwise there was nothing, there's no reason why I wouldn't have continued. And then around that time, I remember I told while I was still in counseling. Actually, no, I didn't say this to, I didn't say that to Brett. I actually said something directly to Tina. So anyway, Tina was telling me that since I wasn't working, basically they said that since I wasn't working, that my requirement was to go to take my son and myself to these medical appointments, which I was doing already. But then they had all these people colluding to ban both me and my son from going to any doctor. So they were trying to make me look like a bad mother, like I couldn't work with anybody, and therefore was a danger to my son, because how could my son get normal care? They also tried to make me look like I was a hypochondriac when I wasn't. My son had some serious issues, and they weren't addressing those things. I couldn't even get my records from federal agencies like the Chelan Douglas Health Department. When Columbia Valley wouldn't give me the records about his vaccinations, I was then refused documentation from the health department, which they're supposed to help me with, or any citizen with. And then so basically I was being banned from one doctor and banned from the dentist, banned from all these different places, and I wasn't doing anything wrong. I at that point already had some documentation that showed that I'd had injuries. It wasn't a normal delivery. I had medical records that showed I had a severe prolapse. And then finally, when no doctor, I asked every single medical facility in Wenatchee to do an x-ray of my tailbone. And they already had a CT. They'd already done the CT that showed abnormal fluid. So these doctors all talk, with each other. And here I had this abnormal CT from Dr. Butler's offices showing there's something wrong. But then no doctor in the entire town was willing to do an x-ray to look further. And I was in a lot of pain. So finally one day I took myself and my son in the car, and I drove down to Seattle, went to the emergency room. I said I slipped and fell and hurt my back and my tailbone. And I think I bumped into something, but basically I needed an x-ray of my injury. So they took an x-ray of my pelvis, and it was fractured. So it wasn't just a broken tailbone, which I had a broken tailbone. My pelvis was fractured. There were serious damages. So then I had in my hands, I had this x-ray and lab report. The lab report said that it was clearly from traumatic childbirth. So I had a lab report that stated from a doctor, this is from traumatic childbirth. Then I had an x-ray that proved my pelvis was fractured. And then I had a different document that showed I was prolapsed. And this woman said that nobody my age and of my health and strength should have that kind of a prolapse, and it would possibly affect how many kids I could have later. And that was from Wenatchee Valley Clinic. And then on top of that, I also had a CT that showed I had abnormal fluid 3 months in my pelvic region, 3 months after the delivery. So clearly my pelvis was broken. My pelvis was fractured. I had some kind of abnormal fluid seeping into my pelvic region, something abnormal going on, which was never followed up on, and I was prolapsed. Those are not the marks, and I had urology reports that showed I couldn't pee for over a month. On top of that, my son had a major head injury, which still had a scab, and I took photos of, and those photos were stolen. I had taken him to the dentist when he was only 2 months old because he cut teeth very, very early. He cut teeth way earlier than the average. And the dentist said at the first visit, he said there's something wrong with his teeth. And he said the only thing that can cause this is severe pressure from an abnormal childbirth. And I hadn't said anything to him about having an abnormal childbirth. He just said that that's what causes this. It was called enamel dysplasia. And he told me that he'd have sensitivity to heat and different things and have less protection on his teeth against cavities, and that it wasn't a big deal if it just affected his baby teeth, but it could also have, he said the severity of the baby teeth, of what happened to the baby teeth, was it could mean that his permanent teeth were also affected. And I thought, I said, well, what can you do about it at that point? And he said, well, sometimes they have to put veneers on a child's regular adult teeth because of this problem. So here my son's going to need maybe veneers because of what these people did at the hospital. And here I had all of these serious injuries. And yet Central Washington Hospital and Stacy Stubblefield and Dr. Butler are saying, according to their records, normal spontaneous delivery. And then I'm supposedly an alcoholic, drug-seeking nut. Okay, all of the evidence argued against that. All of the evidence showed that my son and I were going to have a major lawsuit with a big payoff. So what did they do? They got their friends who are involved in the military and the federal government to torture us. And they decided to find a way for sure to take my son away from me, because if I didn't have guardianship of my son, I couldn't file a lawsuit for him.